And our discussion leader, whom some of you have met in previous events with us, Paul Gibbons, is an international consultant. He's the founder of a company called Future Considerations, a London-based consultancy serving the global financial services market. He's author of a relatively new book published in 2014, The Science of Successful Organizational Change. He's a well-known public speaker, executive coach, and also an adjunct professor here at the Daniels College of Business. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to start our discussion off.
Thank you. Dan and I had a very robust discussion about which topics to choose. I had some different ones, and he had some different ones. And what was interesting about that discussion is that these three topics do not by any means exhaust a list of ethical topics we could have brought up for 2015. We had Martin Shkreli, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he's a hedge fund mismanager and also implicated in the increasing the price of a life-saving drug by 750%. That's a very interesting issue. We also had Uber, which is having a powerful effect for good and sometimes for ill in a number of communities. We could have brought that up. And today, just yesterday, Apple is in the news with something which is of vital interest to all of us about sometimes the question of liberty versus security. And there's a very famous phrase, if you give up a little liberty to get some security, you deserve neither. And it's a question we'll be wrestling with, I think, for the next several years, is the Apple question. So this doesn't exhaust the list, but these are the ones we thought would be most fertile for today. And so we prepared with my colleague a cheat sheet. These are enormously complex issues. There will be many, many books, full-length books written about each one of them. These are some of the facts of the case. In Volkswagen, 500,000 cars were recalled. That soon became 11 million cars. The defeat device recognizes when the engine is being tested by the regulators. It reduces the nitrous oxide emissions, which are the most toxic. And then when the test has passed, they go back to normal settings, which improve the gas mileage and the CO2 emissions. So there's a trade-off there. And the engineers found a way to defeat that. Volkswagen are enormous. They're the #1 in the world. They have 3.5% of the United States car market. Their strategy is to stay and remain #1 in the world. Penetration of the U.S. market is essential to that. And there are some interesting regulatory points. In many industries, the U.S. is less highly regulated than in this particular instance. The U.S. is actually more tightly regulated, it seems, than the European car industry. And the regulators in Europe take a self-regulation approach, in a way. So there will be some interesting facts about that. The board will be interested to many of my colleagues here as well. The complexion of the board is very interesting at Volkswagen. It's about half representatives from the union. There are 2 representatives from the local government, the state of Saxony. And there are only one management representative, and then 2 representative seats from families, very old German families. One name you'll know, Porsche, and the other one is Pierre. And they both get seats, and in one article on this, one of those seats is held by someone who, prior to joining the board of Volkswagen, was a kindergarten teacher. There's some, that's obviously a controversial thing. So there are questions there about board representation, the thing we want to pay attention to when we get into the content. Of course, there are no independent directors, what we think of as an independent expert director on the board. In FIFA, this has been around. This is the worst kept secret in sports, apparently. Much like doping in biking and some of the doping in the Olympics. It finally began to surface about the middle of the last decade with a number of documentaries in England. It seems to me that those were completely ignored for about a decade. It broke into the news in 2014, 2015. Sepp Blatter, S-E-P-P, Blatter, was the president of FIFA and has been for a very long time. He's investigated for 150 million in bribes. But the whole organization, I think there have been 19 arrests. Is that correct, Jamie? There have been 19 arrests, several people in the United States in sports marketing organizations, and several FIFA executives from around the world. There's implications in bribery for the games in Russia, which are about to happen in 2 years, for the games in Qatar, which are about to happen in 6 years, for the games which happened in South Africa. The very president of South Africa is implicated in a $10 million potentially alleged $10 million bribe to the organization to secure the games for South Africa. And so the antecedents or the causes of this are very interesting. It is hard to, living in the United States, particularly in this part of the United States, appreciate the size of the World Cup. It's an extraordinary thing. It's as if the Super Bowl happens in 209 countries in the world at the same time, but for 6 weeks. It's an extraordinary amount of money at stake. And the estimates that Brazil will spend something like $15 billion. They'll spend $15 billion on new stadia. So it's an extraordinary amount of money to go around in the World Cup, and it's huge business. So the non-economic benefits, because a lot of that money may not be recouped, are enormous too. The feel-good factor, putting your country on the national stage, there's an enormous amount at stake. So it's fair to say, in the instance of FIFA, all of the executives have been dragged kicking and screaming into court. There have been no people willing, apart from one gentleman, willing to come forward and say, mea culpa, and let me assist you in your investigations. That's unlike the case with Volkswagen, where almost the day after the chief executive stepped down. There was one very interesting quote from one of the head of Volkswagen North America, gave testimony really very quickly, very soon into the investigation, about 4 weeks in. And he gave testimony, and one of the things he said was very interesting. He said, "It looks to me as if only a couple of engineers were involved." He said, "And I realize it's incredibly hard to believe." So we'll still find. I'm just wondering whether you could put a defeat device on 11 million cars with only a couple of guys in a back room running the shows. So very interesting. But again, Volkswagen handled this very differently, and one of the things we'll want to pick up as people who are business executives is not how the ethical failure happened. That's interesting. It's super interesting. We want to talk about that. But we want to talk about the response, because there are famous examples of very strong responses with Johnson & Johnson with Tylenol, and then very poor responses. So how do people respond is an ethical dilemma in itself. And then finally onto LIBOR. I was a trader. I used to do this back in the 1980s for my sins. So LIBOR may, again, not mean that much in the middle of the United States. $450 trillion of financial assets are priced off LIBOR. That's a lot of money, last I checked. And it touches every aspect, every loan to every corporation, every loan to every sovereign, every piece of sovereign debt in the world. It's fundamental to the functioning of the international banking system. So there were two types of manipulations that happened. One was external, and one seems to imply collusions among the banks, and there's even a question about whether the British government were involved in some of this collusion. So one of the things they did is LIBOR is used to price credit transactions. And so a bank like Barclays will have a lot of credit transactions on its books that are very sensitive in value to the price of LIBOR. The people who are, in a sense, managing that part of Barclays' credit portfolio would go to the traders who fix the LIBOR, which is a global standard interest rate benchmark, and say, I have such and such positions. Can you move LIBOR up or down in order to benefit my positions? And so they did. They put in different bids. London Interbank offered rate. They put in different bids for the price of LIBOR based on the proprietary positions of Barclays Bank. So that's the internal dimension of it. The external dimension of it is that when Barclays was in considerable trouble in 2007 and 2008, there was another incentive, because if your LIBOR, your borrowing rate, seemed to the world to be higher, it's an implication that there was distress. There's a big difference between borrowing at 3% or 4% or 5%. And so there was an incentive then for Barclays to keep their LIBOR rates low, so it looked like they weren't in distress. Now, were that just Barclays, that wouldn't affect any of us very, very much. But these rates are, again, set by Barclays, are a global interest rate standard. So there are winners and losers. There's also an implication in the press, you might have seen, that this was done in such a British way, but I think it was the Minister of the Treasury, or it might have been George Osborne, got in touch with the then CEO of Barclays, who's called Bob Diamond, and in the most British, understated way, wanted to know why Barclays' LIBOR rates seemed to be a little bit higher than everyone else, thus bringing up the average for the banking system. And in a very British way, suggested we don't really want to have these things up as high as perhaps they are. And could we perhaps moderate these in a very, very indirect British diplomatic way? So there's an implication as well during the time of the crisis that in order to keep banks looking stable, we wanted to keep LIBOR as low as possible. So this is an enormous manipulation. UBS was fined $1.5 billion. 2 traders were arrested. But what's really interesting is that they've been unable to catch anybody else in the net. Now this is an extraordinary thing. There are 150 different LIBOR rates set every day. 10 currencies, 15 different rate fixings. That's an amazing thing. How did only 2 guys have been prosecuted, these 2 UBS guys, 6 brokers were prosecuted and exonerated, I should hasten to add, one of whom, by the way, goes by the moniker Lord LIBOR. So it's a fascinating thing, right? This guy's off. And so here we have something which is truly, truly systemic. Affects everybody in the world. So I'm going to introduce, just before turning over to some of our experts here, a couple of the headline ethical issues. Those of you who've been here before remember we had a session on ethical fading. Ethical fading is when you take an issue that most of us in this room would see as an ethical issue and turn it into some other kind of issue, an engineering issue or a commercial issue. And so for the engineers at Volkswagen, how to get the emissions down was an engineering problem. It wasn't an ethical problem. That's called ethical fading. The other thing is the revolving door that we talk about in the United States quite a lot between industry, regulators, and lobbyists. And obviously you want experts regulating your industry, but when it becomes too cozy, then you have problems with potentially collusion or potentially the old boys club. And the gentleman who runs the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom was the auditor originally, earlier in his career at KPMG, of one of the banks who was being investigated by the Financial Conduct Authority. So you have an example of possible conflict of interest due to a regulator having been heavily involved in the industry. We have, these are on an enormous scale. I mean, most countries are extremely well represented in this as well. It's funny, Europe and Africa actually come off the worst probably as well. But these are literally every country in the world is affected by these. The scale of the incentives, it's the world's number 1 car maker, the world's largest sporting event, the most important interest rate benchmark. These are the biggest things in the world. Trillions in assets, billions in sales and profits, and millions of dollars in individual compensation. One of the traders at UBS, Hayes, made $5 million in bonuses in his first 9 months at Citibank. So it's real money. And those questions we want to ask ourselves as we get into this are what are the incentives in the system for these ethical mishaps. One of the things I've written a lot about in my books is groupthink. We want our teams of people who make decisions, governance decisions, to be collegial, to be friendly, and to have that sort of esprit de corps that we enjoy so much among our friends and colleagues with whom we deliberate. In the 1960s, a psychologist called Irving Janis developed an idea that's now in the public speak called groupthink. And Janis hypothesized that the more friendly we were with one another as business decision makers, and in this case business ethics decision makers, the more likely we were to collude and not ask ourselves the hard questions. And then finally, we want to think about conflict of interest. Are there any gray lines here between what's normal political behavior? For example, the president of South Africa doing his utmost to influence the global organization FIFA, to select his country. Is there a gray line between he using his political influence and then outright bribery? It's an interesting question. And then finally, one of the things I think is very interesting is all of these things are very personal. One's own country, one's own self-interest, and frequently those very personal concerns, the future of my car industry, the future of Wolfsburg, Germany, where Volkswagens are made, the future of my country and its place on the world stage in soccer, the future of my bank, the future of the banking industry. These are all deeply emotional concerns about which any normal human being would be deeply concerned. They frequently compete with ethical abstractions. You know, the words we talk about when we talk about values, honesty and integrity, are abstract. And so these very deep emotional and personal concerns frequently compete with abstractions. So those are perhaps some things we'll think about. I'd like to turn first, if I may, over to Bud. Are you ready to go with Volkswagen?
Yes, sir.